Welcome to Hot Topics Conversations, hosted by PLMA's interest groups, which are open to all PLMA member practitioners who like to join others in an effort to address a special area of interest. And now, please welcome the moderator for today's session, PLMA's Retail Pricing Interest Group co-chair, Jordan Folks of Opinion Dynamics, who will introduce our speaker and today's conversation. Jordan, please take it away.
Rich. Hey, everybody, this is Jordan Folks with Opinion Dynamics and your retail pricing co-chair. And we've definitely been watching this California income graduated fixed charge. It's definitely been a hot topic, a hotly debated topic, and there's a lot of different opinions on the issue. And today we just want to kind of dive into the facts. What is it? Where did it come from? What does it mean? What could it look like? And so today is going to be a really great overview of kind of this idea. And we're joined by one of the people that was involved in the origins of the income graduated fixed charge. We have Severin Borenstein with us today. Severin is with he's a professor at the Graduate School in Economic Analysis and Policy Group of the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. And he has a presentation for us today related to this income graduated fixed charge. So if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat, as well as at the end of his presentation, we'll turn off the screen share and we will have some time for Q&A. You can even come off camera and we can have an open conversation after his presentation. So with that, I will pass it over to Severin, and excited to see presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. I will just say I'm not going to be monitoring the chat, so I won't be responding in real time. I think Jordan's going to read it as it happens. I can't multitask, do that, and also give the presentation. Okay, so I'm hoping you can now see my slides. And this is joint work with Meredith Fowley and Jim Salee. This work actually started around 2019. And we, at that time, were just thinking about the high electricity rates and trying to unpack why they're so high. And then started thinking about, well, what could we do about it? And a paper we put out in February of 2021 suggested the income graduated fixed charge. It also suggested another alternative, and actually one I'm more fond of generally, which is moving a lot of costs onto the state budget that have been sent to electricity bills, even though they are determined by state policies. So I'll get back to that. But in some ways, our paper, if not the origin, was certainly one of the catalysts of the current discussion. We've since put out a second report that looks at how the burden of high electricity prices is actually allocated across individuals in different income categories. And I'm going to talk about both of those today. So the starting point, of course, is that we're trying to do something to decarbonize our energy system. A big part of that is to generate a lot of clean electricity and to electrify as many things as we can and get them off of alternative fuels like natural gas and gasoline. The electricity rate structure is, of course, crucial here. If you make electricity really expensive, it is going to deter people from electrifying their transportation, their space heating, their water heating, and other potential uses. So high prices are a barrier to acceptance of these alternatives. California is a leader here. We're a leader in so many things, but this is one we'd rather not be a leader in. As this graph shows, California prices are going up much more rapidly than the rest of the country, and this only goes to 2021. If you extend this to 2023, it's even more extreme. California is really getting out of line with the rest of the country. And part of the early part of our study was to ask, well, why is that? Why are California prices going up so rapidly? And I will get to that. What we find is that these rates disproportionately hit disadvantaged households, low-income households, and that if you look at what's going on in California, it very likely foreshadows trends that are going to occur elsewhere in the country and in the world as we decarbonize and as we are increasingly hit by the effects of climate change. So the four takeaways that I'll just put out front are: we have very high prices. The prices we pay in California for electricity are well above what economists call social marginal cost. That is the marginal cost of generating and delivering electricity plus the cost of the emissions and pollution externalities coming from the electricity generation. That difference between price and social marginal cost, we label an electricity tax. Now, if you don't like that term, don't worry about it. You can just label it a gap. But the point is that when I consume an extra kilowatt hour, we estimate it costs somewhere around 10 cents per kilowatt hour, including the pollution externalities, whereas my retail price in California these days is over 40 cents a kilowatt hour. So that gap is saying I have to pay a price that's much higher than the cost that's imposed on society when I consume more electricity. And that, of course, is going to deter me from consuming more electricity in a way that economists would say is socially inefficient, because if you're willing to pay the full cost, including the pollution externalities, then you value the use of that more than the cost to society. Equally important, it also is going to deter us from switching from gasoline and natural gas and consuming energy services powered by fossil fuels. We cover these costs in California by increasing the volumetric price of electricity. California has no fixed charges from their investor-owned utilities. That's an outlier, but even in the country as a whole, the average is about 10% of bills are fixed charges. So the vast majority of these costs are paid for through volumetric per kilowatt hour prices. What we find is that this burden, the way this burden of the price being, the recovery of these fixed costs being through prices that are well above social marginal costs, is disproportionately falls on low-income households. And what we then suggest is alternative ways. One is the income graduated fixed charge, and another is changing how these programs are paid for. This is just a reminder, California utilities, those three dots, are well out of line with the rest of the country. Partially, of course, that's due to the natural monopoly aspect of electricity service. Electricity service includes transmission and distribution. Most of those costs are fixed. They are not part of marginal costs. And one of the age-old challenges in electric utility regulation is how do you cover those costs without setting prices that are so high as to inefficiently deter usage of the product. We do it in a way that maximizes that inefficiency by doing it through high volumetric pricing. In part, of course, that's because fixed charges that are uniform are very regressive, and there's an aversion to that. But virtually all fixed costs and priorities funded via ratepayers, which are not incremental costs, and just to give you one example, energy efficiency programs are paid for through higher electricity rates. And obviously, when I consume more electricity, that energy efficiency programs is not a marginal cost of me consuming more electricity. Just to remind people who haven't studied California's electricity system lately, we have three large investor-owned utilities: PG&E, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric. Pacific Core is their service territory is larger than San Diego, but they have very, very few customers. PG&E has about 5 million residential customers, as does Southern California Edison, and San Diego has about 1 million. This is an analysis we do of social marginal cost. That the breakdown is in the first report, trying to look at what are the components of social marginal cost. A couple things to take away from here. First of all, up until 2012, California did not have a cap and trade program. So after 2012, we break the emissions costs into the part paid for through the cap and trade program and the part that is not covered in cap and trade, assuming $50 a ton for the social cost of carbon emissions. We have done this analysis at a higher price of the social cost of carbon, and it doesn't really change the results at all for reasons I can get into. The other thing to notice is a downward trend over the last 5 years. While we have been transitioning to renewables and have been putting a lot more other costs into rates, the actual marginal cost of providing electricity has been going down in California. This is PG&E's rates compared to that social marginal cost. California has a very aggressive, I believe the most aggressive in the country, low-income program. So we have a rate for people who are not on the low-income program and a lower rate for people who are. But even people on the low-income program are paying prices now well above social marginal cost. And people who are on regular rates are paying a price that's, this is in 2019, about 3 times social marginal cost. And that is probably closer to 4 or 5 times today. We have seen rates go up quite dramatically in the last 2 years. We then broke out these retail rates to ask the question of, where's this coming from? The bottom staircase of this waterfall graph is marginal costs, generation, incremental transmission needs, distribution, GHG pollution. The upper staircase is things that are not marginal. Generation, this is from contracts that have been signed at what are now above market prices. Transmission, which is largely a fixed cost, and that includes a lot of grid hardening and wildfire mitigation now, and distribution. And likewise, a lot of these costs are about dealing with climate change, and virtually no distribution costs are marginal. Almost all of them are fixed costs. And then there are the public purpose programs. The 2 biggest components of this are paying for the low income program, which is paid for by raising rates on everyone else, and paying for the transfers to people who put in rooftop solar, because by putting in rooftop solar under net energy metering, you avoid paying for these fixed costs. And by doing that, you save probably 40 cents a kilowatt hour these days, but the utility only saves 10 cents, and the difference has to be made up by raising rates on everyone else. Also in here are energy efficiency programs, funding for EV charging stations, etc. So I think I've now talked about most of these legacy infrastructure costs, vegetation management, grid hardening, some new technologies being put on the grid to prevent wildfires. These are all important expenditures, but they're not a marginal cost of a customer consuming another kilowatt hour. We also, due to some laws in California, pay for wildfire victim compensation through raising electricity rates if the wires were the cause, and if the utility was not negligent. If the utility was negligent, then the shareholders have to pay for it. But if it was not considered negligent but still responsible, then that goes into rates. Subsidies for new R&D, low income, etc. All of these are rising, and California rate increases over the last couple of years have been much greater than the national average. California is different from the rest of the country. This is some analysis I did with Jim Bushnell a few years ago. And you see areas where price is way above social marginal costs, such as California and New England. You also see areas where price is below social marginal costs, that is in the Midwest, where there's a lot of coal emissions. And that causes both local pollution costs and also greenhouse gas costs. So California, as I said, this is done assuming $50 a ton for the cost of CO2 emissions. Even if you ratchet that up to $200 a ton, that only raises the social cost or the social marginal cost by 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And so the gap between our retail prices and social marginal costs remains huge. Okay, I'm a quick aside, and some people pick up on this. We are assuming that we want to price electricity from an economic point of view at social marginal cost to send the right incentives, but that's not quite right if we are mispricing its substitutes, particularly gasoline and natural gas. In some other work I did with Jim Bushnell, we actually looked at that and found that gasoline is underpriced almost everywhere in the country due to its pollution externalities that are not priced in. Natural gas, it turns out, is about on average priced right. Two offsetting factors. One is we're paying for a whole lot of fixed infrastructure, so that would tend to raise the price relative to marginal cost. But on the other hand, we're not paying for the methane leaks and CO2 emissions, and that would mean the price is not incorporating those costs. So if those substitutes are underpriced, as gasoline is, then pricing all the way to the social marginal cost of electricity probably doesn't make sense. And it turns out that if you really want to incorporate something like is being discussed in the Biden administration right now, something closer to $180 or $200 per ton, that probably doesn't change our conclusions much at all, in part because if we're not going to price that into gasoline, as there doesn't seem to be any sign of doing, then a big part of the efficiency is the relative price of these two energy sources. Okay, let me get to the sort of meat of what people are interested in here probably, which is who pays this electricity tax? What's the burden? And what we do is we start by just calculating that electricity tax, that difference between price and social marginal cost. We have billing data for households for the three major utilities. And what we do is we go household by household and calculate how much they're paying in excess of the social marginal cost of providing that electricity. That number on average is $700 per year. And that is more than half of the electricity bill that the average household in California receives. So more than half of the bill that people are paying is not going towards paying the marginal cost of providing the electricity. It's going towards paying for a lot of fixed costs. The heart of our second report is looking at how that cost burden is shared, particularly between advantaged and disadvantaged households. To do that, of course, we need some measure of advantage or disadvantage, which we use income. Income is not the perfect measure. There are some people who have low income but a lot of wealth, some people who have high income but very little wealth. And so we're sort of not capturing everything, but it's something that's measurable, and it's what's used by federal and state governments. We impute income through a statistical process I'm not going to spend time on today, but I'm happy to discuss offline if anyone's interested, that basically takes the census block group where we have data on the distribution of income, and then within census block group uses other indicators to allocate households to the distribution in that census block group. So we've done a lot of statistical analysis in this area trying to get income imputation right. It's not right. I will just say it's right on average, but for any one household, it's almost certainly still very noisy. But on average, within the census block group, it allocates people across the distribution accurately. Okay, here's the first result once we have this income imputation, and that is that this is consumption per year by income group. And it is clear, nobody's surprised, that wealthier households consume more electricity than poorer households. But there are two takeaways from this. First, let's focus on PG&E, the red lines. They're sort of the middle case here. San Diego is the extreme case. The highest income group consumes less than twice as much as the lowest income group, while having an income that's more than 8 times higher. So if you think about that allocation of the cost of these fixed costs, the lower income families are paying a higher share of their income than higher income families. The other thing to note is this gets more extreme when you actually take into account the adoption of rooftop solar. And that's because rooftop solar is disproportionately put in by wealthier households, and it reduces the number of kilowatt hours they have to pay for, and therefore it reduces their contribution towards these fixed costs. So the red line is the net consumption of households, whereas the dashed line is the net consumption, whereas the solid line is the gross consumption when you put that rooftop solar generation back in. And what you see is the red line is the dashed line is even flatter than the solid line, meaning that on net consumption, the wealthiest households consume only about 50% more than the poorest households, even though their income is 8 times higher or more. So what we found here is that, yes, it is true that wealthier people consume more, but it is nowhere near proportionate to their higher income, which really isn't a surprise when you think about the way electricity is consumed. So flat volumetric pricing recovers more costs from wealthier households, but not proportionally to income. In that sense, it is what we would call a regressive tax. It takes a larger share of low-income households. This shows that these are called box and whiskers plots. The dots are the mean for each group, the average. The whiskers show the 5th percentile to the 95th percentile. So looking at PG&E, we'll focus on here. It's the middle. It's the middle case. You can see the mean goes up. So the wealthier households do pay more towards this excess payment. But as a share of income, the red dashed line, it goes down. And in fact, the lowest income categories pay a much higher share of their income than the highest income categories on average towards these fixed costs. So this is, in that sense, a very regressive tax. How regressive? Well, we decided to compare it to other taxes. In California, we have an income tax that's a very progressive income tax. We have a sales tax that is generally considered regressive, and we have a gas tax. This is the same graph, but we use different cutoffs because the income tax, the ratio of income is so high that that we had to have a different scale. This shows that the wealthiest households pay about between 35 and 40 times higher income taxes than the poorest households do. And we've combined the two lowest categories here because of the actual 0 to 25 is generally paying almost zero. In order to see the other taxes, we then use a different scale. And what you see is the sales tax, the blue line, the wealthiest households pay almost 4 times as much as the poorest, which is more progressive than the electricity tax, where they pay about 3 times. The electricity tax actually looks a lot like the gas tax in terms of regressivity until you get to the very highest category. But for everything below the highest income category, what we're calling the electricity tax, that recovery of that gap, is about as regressive as a gas tax, which is generally considered quite regressive among tax economists. There's another aspect to this, which is that electrification causes a cost premium the electricity tax causes a cost premium for electrification. And we calculated that using the average amount of heating and the average amount of vehicle miles driven in each category, in each utility territory. And what we find is it varies across the utilities, but for both electric vehicles and for space heating, on average, this electricity tax is increasing the cost per year of electrifying these two energy services by about $700 per year. So this is a very significant cost to electrification relative to if we charge people the burden they are truly imposing on society when they use that extra electricity. So I'll finish up by talking about solutions, and then we can get to the Q&A, which will no doubt be the more fun part of this. The idea here is, how do we get those volumetric rates down to something that is closer to reflecting the actual marginal cost, including pollution, of consuming more electricity? Because by doing that, depending on how we pay for it, we take some of the burden off of the low-income households who are disproportionately burdened, and we make electrification much more attractive because the operating costs of a heat pump water heater, heat pump space heating, an electric vehicle, an electric clothes dryer, all come way down. In the case of California these days, they would come down by more than 2/3. One approach is that we could move costs onto the state budget. And let me give you just one example California has this very aggressive low-income program for electricity with a 30 to 35% discount off of the retail price. We also have a program for food security that also targets low-income households. And we also, of course, have our version of Medicaid, which is called Medi-Cal here. The electricity low-income program is paid for by raising the rates of electricity for everyone else. The food and medical programs are paid for out of the state budget and therefore are paid for primarily by income taxes and partially by sales taxes. So we have chosen to put this low-income program into electricity rates, which is really inconsistent with the other ways we are supporting low-income households. Similarly, we have energy efficiency programs that are paid for by raising the rates for electricity. There was a time that was argued to make a lot of sense because rates were thought to be too low. They weren't reflecting the full pollution costs. But now rates are so high when you actually do these calculations, the rates are far above the cost of providing electricity, including all of those pollution costs. So we argue that there are many of these programs. One last example, in California, we have a state agency that deals with wildfires called CAL FIRE. CAL FIRE is responsible for vegetation management in most places, but not where we have the utility lines. If there's a tree that dies and it's 50 feet from a transmission line, that's the utility's problem. If that same tree dies and it's 500 feet from a utility line, that's CAL FIRE's problem. We could certainly change that and say that CAL FIRE is responsible and it's supported through the state budget for all vegetation management. And then we could also argue that a lot of the costs that utilities currently are incurring are due to climate change. And in many other areas, we are supporting adaptation to climate change through the state budget. In electricity, we're paying for it by raising electricity rates, which is just a much more regressive way to pay for it, as well as shooting ourselves in the foot if we really want people to electrify their energy use. We floated that idea. I have floated that idea with legislators. It doesn't get a lot of support. Legislators really like mandating things and not paying for them. And so they have generally not been terribly supportive. There's been a bit of movement, but so far that really hasn't gotten a lot of traction. In contrast, we also suggested this possibility of a fixed charge. A fixed charge on its own, of course, is very regressive. It takes the same amount from every household. But we suggested this idea of an income graduated fixed charge. That was our role in this political movement that's happened. We actually didn't even hear about it being incorporated into the state budget in 2022 until after the bill had passed, and somebody called us up and said, "Did you realize this is actually in law now?" And the law that passed said that the California Public Utilities Commission shall implement an income graduated fixed charge. They shall pass it in 2024 and start using it in 2025. We also looked at an alternative some people suggested, which is minimum bills. If you look at the numbers and the suggested levels of $30 or $60, even $60 a month, it just doesn't make much of a dent at all in the revenue requirement. Most people are already above that, or if they're below it, they're not below it by very much. So you just don't get much more revenue. The other thing we found is that a minimum bill is actually more regressive than even a uniform fixed charge. It would take more money from low-income households than from high-income households. So we don't see a minimum bill as a real viable alternative. How would an income graduated fixed charge work? This is complicated. Essentially, this is implementing an income tax as part of the electricity bill. Obviously, that's not ideal since we already have an agency that does income taxation, and because almost no one wants the utility to be asking about their income. One approach, and it sounds like one that is the direction we're going, is that some third party will take the income tax data, possibly our tax authority called the Franchise Tax Board, will, for every household, calculate which bucket they're in of fixed charge, and will send the information to, in my case, Pacific Gas and Electric, telling them Severin Borenstein is in bucket 4 of your income categories. And the utility would then use it to charge me the fixed charge for people who are in bucket 4. That still reveals some information about me, but far less than if the utility was actually collecting income data. So far, this is still being debated, but that approach seems to be the most likely approach. We actually did some calculations and said, well, how big could an income graduated fixed charge be? So what we did is we asked, if we lowered that volumetric price, this is all on 2019 data, so the gap is larger now. But if we lowered it to social marginal cost, how big would a fixed charge have to be? And the first answer is if everybody paid the same fixed charge for PG&E, it would be $67 a month, which is nearly 2/3 of bills on average. An alternative approach is this, what we call income graduated fixed charge. We constructed this one, and it's completely arbitrary, but we constructed one designed to be about as regressive as the sales tax, which is not as regressive as the current approach, but giving the lowest income category a 0 fixed charge. So those people are necessarily better off because their price per kilowatt hour has come down. For everyone else, they have to pay a fixed charge based on income. The highest fixed charge here is $150 per month for people making over $200,000 a year. But importantly, that is not how much their bills would go up, because their price per kilowatt hour would go way down. And so they would have a big savings on their energy component, but they'd have a very large fixed charge. How big an effect will that have? Well, we took the billing data and did that calculation. Among the lowest income category, everybody's better off. Their bill goes down by more than $500 a year. Among the highest category, their bill goes up, and it goes up by, on average, about $55 a month. Now, for some people who are huge electricity users, even in the highest income category, their bill goes down. For some people, and particularly people who have installed very large rooftop solar systems, so they are paying almost nothing on their electricity bills, their bill would go up. And in fact, if you have installed a system that is so large that it has zeroed out your bill, then your bill goes up by about $1,800 a year, which is the monthly charge times your times 100, the monthly charge of 150 times 12, because you were before paying nothing and now you have to pay the fixed charge. Interestingly, through most of the income distribution, the average change in bill is pretty small. Even for fairly wealthy people, before you get to the very top category, the average change in bill is around $20 a month. For the very wealthiest category, it's larger because these do tend to be substantially larger consumers. Except for people who didn't have rooftop solar and had and were using a lot of electricity, they could actually be better off. And then the people who have rooftop solar, or for some other reason just use very little electricity but are quite wealthy, they would be worse off. Yeah, and so there is substantial variation in the impact this has within each income category. I'll finish up just saying this has been adopted in legislation, as I mentioned. The legislation says there must be at least 3 rates. The utilities have come back with proposals that actually have 4 rates. This is PG&E's, $15 per month for households below $28,000, $30 for $28,000 to $69,000, $51 for $69,000 to $180,000, and $92 per month for households above $180,000. This would cut volumetric rates by about 1/3, still way above social marginal cost, but it would make electrification substantially more attractive, and it would reduce the burden on the lowest income households. So to finish up, the current rate structures have very high prices. We think that this is something that we're going to see in a lot of other areas of the country. That makes slowing decarbonization through electrification much more difficult, and it also disproportionately hurts low-income customers. That cost pressure in California is getting massively worse. I'll just give you one quick example. PG&E has proposed spending $7 billion a year on undergrounding and grid hardening and wildfire risk management over the next 3 years. Their entire revenue requirement in 2019 was $12 billion. So this is not a small impact. This is going to have huge effects on electricity rates. We can make improvements. Moving costs onto the state budget would be my first choice. And there has been some movement in that direction, but the bill that started to move some costs onto the state budget died in the state legislature last year. As part of the budget settlement, however, there was this clause inserted that directed an income graduated fixed charge. Currently, there is a proceeding at the CPUC to determine how big that fixed charge will be, and various parties have come in. I showed you the PG&E's proposal. The rooftop solar industry has come in with an alternative proposal where the top fixed charge for the highest income would be, I think, $11 a month. Our response to that has been, it just almost certainly is not worth the administrative cost if that's all you're going to do. This is going to require some administrative burden. If you're not going to have a substantial income graduated fixed charge, it almost certainly doesn't make sense to have any at all. On the other hand, I think that there will be another attempt this year in the state legislature to move costs onto the state budget, and I'm hopeful that that will make some progress. Ongoing work, we're continuing to refine our estimates of the inequality impacts and to look at the impacts on solar adoption and electrification of high rates. So that's the related work, and I will stop there, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Jordan now, and I think I'm supposed to stop sharing, which I may have just done.
Wow, what an incredible presentation. I've been following this for a while, and this answered a lot of questions I had and provided so much incredible background information. Thank you for that. So we're going to open it up for Q&A with the audience now. So a couple disclaimers. Remember, Severin, doesn't work for the state or the utilities, so we can't necessarily speak to current theories or how things will be implemented. And please, I know this is a hotly debated topic, so please keep comments civil, and let's see what else we can learn here today. So I encourage people to kind of raise their hand using the raise hand feature, and I can call on you and you can come off mute and ask a question. If you prefer, you can also enter it into the chat, which is exactly what Chad has done. Chad, do you want to come off mute and vocalize your question, or do you want me to read it? Okay, so Chad asks, thank you for the presentation. I realize there isn't a solution that benefits everyone, but I just don't see how income graduated fixed charges are the answer. This feels like regulatory socialism to me. A wealth transfer from have to have-nots under the guise of energy equity. I'm not aware of other commodities being priced based upon income. Are you aware of any?
Well, that's absolutely right. But there is a flip side to that. The reason rates are so high in California is that we are paying for a lot of social programs through electricity rates. So we have decided to use electricity rates as a funding mechanism. We don't generally use most other commodities or goods as a funding mechanism. We do have a tax on gasoline that goes to road building, but in general, we pay for most of these social goods, whether it is helping low-income people, building EV charging stations, or whatever, through the state budget. So this isn't my first choice, as I said. My first choice would be to move a lot of these costs onto the state budget. If the legislators won't do that, this is essentially saying we're going to pay for these costs through an income tax. It won't be our usual income tax. It will be income tax implemented through utility bills. I think that has to be distinguished from actually paying for electricity through on an income basis. The actual cost of providing incremental electricity to Severin Borenstein is a quarter of what Severin Borenstein is paying per kilowatt hour. And that would still be covered through my payments per kilowatt hour. What would be taken off, and under the proposals in California, only partially taken off, is the payments that are currently going per kilowatt hour, but actually supporting things that are social programs.
I think it's pronounced Jan asks, my son makes very little money. I make more. Should I put my PG&E account in my son's name? And I know this is something that people have been concerned about.
Yeah, no, this is not going to be easy to implement. You could try doing that. Of course, if your son has his own residence, then that wouldn't really work. Ideally, the Franchise Tax Board could tell what your household income is. So it wouldn't be tied to one person, because generally, of course, there are many two-earner households, and you would want to base it on the household income, not on one individual. If you do base it on one individual, yeah, there's going to be a real incentive to evade this by putting the account in the name of somebody who has a low income. And that is one of the problems of this approach. It is not ideal. It's going to require some real administrative heft to make it work. I think it can be done. The Franchise Tax Board essentially already does this, as does the IRS, because they are verifying how many people live in the house, and if you file jointly, what you're claiming, or if you file separately, that you don't claim the same deductions or exemptions for children and so forth. So it's complicated. This will not be a straightforward approach, and it will be imperfect. But I think there is a way to make this work. And in some sense, we've already done a lot of that legwork through the tax authority.
A quick technical request to PLMA staff. It looks like members cannot unmute. PLMA staff, is it too late for that, or is there a way to change the rules there?
Do you want me to unmute everybody or individually?
Or give them the it seems like they cannot unmute even if they wanted to.
Yes, I can unmute them. You just have to tell me who to unmute.
Okay. Well, again, if you use the raise hand feature, Monica can unmute you. So please let us know if you'd like to come on camera. But Maria, a fellow co-chair of the PLMA Retail Pricing Group, asks, could the administrative heft you mentioned actually cost more than the perceived benefit? This seems complicated.
Yeah, and in fact, I think that's been mine and my co-author's response to the rooftop solar industry proposal. If you're not going to do this at a significant level, the administrative costs are pretty much a fixed cost, whether you're doing this with a highest fixed charge of $10 or $90. Figuring out who goes in what category is going to be pretty much the same cost. So this isn't worth doing unless you're going to do it with a significant fixed charge. With a significant fixed charge, at least from our discussions with the Franchise Tax Board and with the utilities, it sounds like it would move a very significant share of the revenue burden at a administrative cost that's really a pretty small fraction of that. But if you're not going to really do this at a significant scale, I think you would have to revisit, is this really worth it? And particularly, is this worth it if there is an alternative, which is to implement it through the income tax instead of through an income graduated fixed charge?
Well, while we wait for more questions to come into the chat, I have a few that I thought of while you were speaking. So I'm curious, were you able to look at this at more like an hourly level? I'm curious how time of use might impact your modeling results. If there are any rates that the utilities offer that are better in terms of mitigating overpayment or the tax. And did you all look into anything like that?
Well, only at a sort of first order level, but the first order argument is pretty straightforward, which is we would love to see real-time pricing and time varying pricing, but ultimately the non-time varying prices, or just TOU, which is pretty much non-time varying in California, prices we pay are collecting the same revenue. And so it really doesn't change the analysis over the annual average. Because the social marginal cost is still much lower, and the price that we're collecting is much higher. If we did have time varying rates, the allocation of the social marginal cost across individuals would be more appropriate, because people who actually imposed higher costs on the system would be paying more. But in earlier work I did, I actually looked at how big is that difference. And it turns out it's not really very big. Yes, people with air conditioning have a higher cost of service per kilowatt hour because they tend to consume when there is high demand on the system. But even if you correct for that, the marginal cost differs by only a couple of cents per kilowatt hour, compared to this huge gap we see between average price and social marginal cost. That doesn't move the needle very much. That's not to say we shouldn't be doing it. I think there are important reasons we should be doing dynamic pricing to deal with some of the congestion issues, and now with some of the intermittent production issues, but it doesn't solve this problem.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I will say for the audience that I know that the plan is that the new rate structures would apply to the existing time of use rate structures. So the volumetric proportional discount and or proportional decrease in volumetric charges would be applied to the various TOU buckets that a given customer may be on.
No, that's what people are talking about. Yeah.
Julie Koo asks, are there other utilities exploring this concept, or is this just California?
So far, it's just California that is this far along, but I have to tell you, we have met with people from NARUC, this group, and then people from a number of utilities around the country who at least want to get a better understanding of what this is and see if it's something that they should be exploring. So it has started a discussion, but I'm not aware of any regulatory process that has even formally begun outside of California.
So Severin, we're like we heard in this chat today, and like we've heard in the larger community elsewhere, there's concern that this is just simply a socialist program that's redistributing wealth. And I'm curious, utilities are claiming that, the IOUs are claiming that with the new income graduated fixed charge, it is revenue neutral, and it does not change the total revenue they collect. It just kind of rejiggers where and how it comes from. So how does your analysis and proposal, what's your response to that, given that you're suggesting that these fixed charges are reduced, making what people pay closer to like what they really should?
Well, I mean, there are two components here. There's a fixed component and a variable component. What this does is it lowers the variable price to reflect more closely, and actually the proposals still aren't getting very close, but more closely, the actual cost you're imposing on the system when you when you use more electricity. As far as the socialist argument goes, we have already turned the electricity system into an income redistribution mechanism, but it's redistributing in the wrong direction. It's redistributing this cost burden relative to paying for things through the state budget away onto the low income customers. So we are paying for EV charging stations. We're paying for rooftop solar subsidies. We're paying for all sorts of systems in ways that disproportionately burden poor people. And in fact, even the people who are poor enough to be on the low income program are paying more than the cost per kilowatt hour they impose on the system. So even low income customers the lowest income customers are paying into this overall program. So yes, this will have an effect on income distribution, and it's intended to change the distribution of the burden. But in many ways, it's intended to undo the regressive distribution that we have built into the system over the last few decades, largely because we have burdened electricity bills with a lot of costs that aren't in the bills in many states, or at least not nearly to the extent they're in California, and which we have chosen when we decided to put in subsidize EV charging stations or spend money on new renewables technologies that may or may not work on the R&D. We've decided to pay for that through raising electricity bills. That doesn't seem like the way that one would typically pay for those systems. And through the examples I gave you, I think it shows that there are many examples where in other industries we pay for it through the state budget. So it seems that this is an attempt to move things back towards what I would say is generally considered a more equitable approach.
I think that's a great argument. And I think it's important for people on this call to remember that there's been a lot of research that's demonstrated that flat rates bring overpayment from low-income customers. They are less costly to serve, and they're paying more than their fair share. Low-income customers have effectively subsidized energy costs for the most affluent. And so I appreciate smart people like yourself trying to figure out some solutions to these issues.
Yeah, I will just say in California, there's an interesting sort of twist on that, which is low-income customers disproportionately in California live in the Central Valley. So they actually consume more electricity, not overall, but than you would think just based on income, because they live in very hot climates. And air conditioning is just really needed if you live in the Central Valley in California. And we are burdening the extra usage by saying if you do that, you also have to pay for more of EV charging stations and energy efficiency programs and all the rest.
I've done some research in the Central Valley, and there's energy efficiency problems abound in the housing stock there, and so only making this problem worse.
Yep, no, that's right.
Chris, my other co-chair from Con Ed New York City, asks, if you funded this through the state budget rather than through energy bills, wouldn't that put some of the burden back on low-income customers through their income sales tax contributions? Or do you envision that the tax collection will be based on income as well?
Well, tax collection is already based on income because most of the state budget is funded through the income tax in California, and that is a progressive income tax. But yeah, low-income customers would still pay something towards these social programs and fixed costs of the utility, but they would pay far less than they pay right now but funding it through higher volumetric rates of electricity. So this would shift the cost back towards wealthier households paying a larger share of those costs.
Curious, did you look at demand charges or demand rates in terms of solution ideas and how that closes the gap?
Yeah, so demand charges, we're not going to be able to do this in the last 2 minutes, but I'll just say two quick things. Demand charges people think of as a form of fixed charge, but they really aren't because they're based on your peak usage in a way that doesn't at all correlate with, or doesn't very well correlate with actual system peak. It's sort of this idea that if you're a bigger consumer, you should pay a bigger fixed charge, but it really sets up distortionary incentives. So as anyone who's worked on demand charges knows, there's a whole industry, and I have former students in this industry, teaching customers how to avoid demand charges. And in some ways, sometimes they put in technologies or spend money to essentially lower their demand charge in ways that are pretty inefficient. So demand charges, I know, are very attractive, and I've written on this, but I think really don't get at the problem we face here.
Fascinating. So we have time for maybe one short question if anyone else has anything else. Well, Severin, thank you so much for shedding some light on the background here. This is really intriguing and fascinating, and I really appreciate you really telling us all about what you've done and where we're going next.
Well, thank you for including me in the discussion. I hope people found this useful. And I am easy to find if you have further questions. There's only one Severin Borenstein. If you Google my name, you will find me. Thank you.
So again, thank you for today's speaker, Severin Borenstein, for an excellent and highly relevant conversation. And thank you to Jordan Folks and the Retail Pricing Interest Group for bringing this topic to us today. We'll take a few minutes now to share some upcoming PLMA events. One is next Wednesday, October 25th. We have a load management dialogue on paths to mitigating climate change. It's going to be hosted by Lee Cravatt, who's the host of the Climate Champions podcast. And he's going to be speaking with some of the PLMA strategic thought leader type folks about where load management fits in as we think about climate champions as we go forward. The following week on November 1st, the Women in Demand Management Affinity Group is hosting a virtual meetup. And the title is going to be Embrace Your Potential. This is part of a 4-step series that they're doing. Some of those things are going to be happening at the conference and some after, but along those lines, this is step 1 and could be a great opportunity for those who are interested in this topic. And then lastly, in less than 3 weeks now, PLMA will be hosting their 48th conference in Charlotte, North Carolina, November 6th through 8th. We already have the better part of 320 people registered, expecting more. That's still an opportunity to register and come enjoy this event. We have over 25 peer-selected presentations in addition to interest group conversations and some workshops on Monday. Get registered and get there. It's the place to be this fall. And otherwise, I thank everyone for joining for today's conversation. Thank you so much for your engagement. And everyone, please have a great day.